Meet Kimberly, a 28-year-old woman who had spent her entire life striving to prove that she was enough, despite the obstacles that often stood in her way. Raised in a small, working-class neighborhood, Kimberly had always been told she was destined for greatness, but at every turn, she encountered resistance. Growing up, she had seen firsthand how the world could sometimes be cruel to people like her. But Kimberly wasn't one to back down. She worked hard, took on multiple jobs to support herself through college, and eventually landed a decent job that allowed her to stand on her own 2 feet. But that didn't mean the world had stopped seeing her as less than. Kimberly wasn't a stranger to being judged by her appearance. She had long since accepted the fact that she would have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And yet, in moments like this, when she was simply trying to live her life, the weight of those judgments felt heavier than ever. It was a typical Saturday for Kimberly, nothing out of the ordinary. She had wrapped up a successful week at work, and today she was treating herself to something she had earned. A quiet trip to the mall, a simple visit to a jewelry store. She wasn't looking for anything grand, she was simply buying a necklace as a token of her hard work. But in the blink of an eye, her day was shattered by a racist accusation that had no basis in reality. She had just found the perfect necklace, a simple piece, understated but elegant, and was admiring it when the confrontation started. Her thoughts were on the glimmer of the gold, on the gentle promise of treating herself, when a man approached her. She wasn't prepared for what would happen next. The man, with his sharp eyes and arrogant posture, would soon make it clear that, in his eyes, Kimberly didn't belong in the store. He would accuse her of something she didn't do, based solely on the color of her skin. He would call security, demand her removal, and without hesitation, the security guards would comply. In that moment, Kimberly knew she wasn't just facing a misunderstanding. She was facing a deeply rooted prejudice that had been waiting for an opportunity to expose itself. Kimberly wasn't just any woman. She had fought her way to this point in her life, overcoming every obstacle with grace, intelligence, and resilience. She wasn't going to let this moment define her, but she knew that this was a fight worth having. The problem was, no one else seemed willing to join her in it. And so, as she was escorted out of the store, a public display of humiliation, Kimberly's mind raced. She was angry, devastated, and yet she knew that this moment wasn't just hers to bear. It was bigger than her. Kimberly had a story to tell, a story that had to be heard. And so, she pulled out her phone, typed a few quick words, and sent them into the digital void, not knowing that the ripple effect of her post would soon reach a place far beyond the mall walls. It started innocently enough. Sarah had just finished her afternoon shift at the local bookstore, where she worked part-time to support her college studies. Her plan for the day was simple: stop by the mall, check out a new line of shoes that had caught her eye, maybe grab a smoothie, and call it a day. She wasn't expecting anything dramatic, just a normal Saturday afternoon. The mall was bustling with activity shoppers walking briskly from store to store, families enjoying the weekend, and teenagers hanging out. Sarah's sneakers clicked lightly on the tile floor as she moved through the aisles of one of her favorite shoe stores. The smell of fresh leather, mixed with the faint scent of vanilla-scented candles from the nearby store, filled the air. She had no agenda other than to treat herself to something she'd been eyeing for a while. Sarah was in a place she felt comfortable, in a place where she thought she could escape the weight of the world, even for a few minutes. She stopped at the display that caught her attention. Black heels, sleek, professional, and elegant. They were the perfect fit for her work environment, a little something to elevate her look while still staying within her budget. As Sarah knelt down to inspect them, she let out a little sigh of contentment. It wasn't just about buying the shoes, it was about the sense of accomplishment, about being able to treat herself to something nice after months of hard work. That's when she noticed him. A man, probably in his mid-50s, dressed in an expensive suit, walked by her. He gave her a long look, but she thought little of it. People glanced at each other all the time in stores. However, the man stopped abruptly a few feet away. Sarah didn't know why, but his eyes fixed on her. She felt his gaze linger for a beat too long. She stood up, adjusting the shoes in her hands, and for a moment, Their eyes locked. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice unnaturally sharp. Sarah, still taken aback by his intensity, smiled politely. "No, I'm just looking at these shoes." He tilted his head slightly, narrowing his eyes, and then, without missing a beat, he added, "I don't think you should be here." The words hit Sarah like a cold wave, a sharp chill that ran down her spine. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. "What?" she asked, confused. The man's lips curled into a tight, unpleasant smile. "You're in a store you don't belong in," he continued, his voice rising with each word. "You should leave." Sarah stood frozen, trying to process what had just been said. "You should leave?" Her chest tightened as she looked around, but no one seemed to be paying attention. The store was filled with other shoppers, but she was the target of this strange, aggressive attention. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," she said quietly, still hoping this was some bizarre misunderstanding. "I'm just looking at shoes. I'm not causing any trouble." The man didn't seem to care. His face twisted into something far less friendly, his eyes narrowing as if she had insulted him with her very presence. "I've seen your kind here before," he spat, his voice now thick with disgust. "Always trying to cause problems, always in the way. You don't belong here. I'm calling security." His words struck like a slap across her face. "You don't belong here." She wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly, if her mind was playing tricks on her, but those words, so harsh, so filled with malice, echoed through her mind. It wasn't just that he had asked her to leave the store. It was the implication, the sheer venom in his words, as if the space itself, the very air she was breathing, had no room for someone like her. The man turned away and began walking toward the front of the store, his words carrying across the room. "Security. Get this woman out of here." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't breathe. She felt the floor tilt beneath her. This isn't happening, she thought. This can't be happening. Before Sarah could gather her thoughts, the two security guards arrived. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions unreadable. They approached Sarah without even making eye contact, their focus solely on the man who had called them. She felt her body tense, the cold dread of what was happening washing over her in waves. The taller of the two security guards, a man in his early 30s with short cropped hair, looked Sarah up and down, not with curiosity, but with a deliberate, dismissive gaze. His eyes lingered for a moment too long, as though assessing her worth based solely on her appearance. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the security guard said without any empathy in his voice. His tone was firm, rehearsed, like he'd said the words many times before. Sarah's heart sank. "What do you mean? I haven't done anything wrong." The guard didn't flinch. "Doesn't matter," he said, his eyes still fixed on her, scanning her from head to toe as if she were a problem to be dealt with. "You need to leave now." She stood still, her mind racing. Is this really happening? Why is no one speaking up? She tried to explain herself, her voice shaking but determined. "I was just looking at some shoes. The man, he accused me of something I didn't do." Her words were choked by the lump in her throat, but she tried to stay calm. The guard didn't even flinch. "You need to leave. No more discussion." In that moment, Sarah understood that the outcome had already been decided. There would be no fairness here. There would be no explanation that mattered. She was already the accused, the guilty one, simply because of who she was. As the security guards began to move closer, Sarah's world seemed to close in around her. Her heart beat loudly in her ears. She could feel the eyes of the other shoppers on her, some of them openly staring, others whispering behind their hands. But not one person spoke up. No one came to her defense. No one even seemed to flinch at the absurdity of what was happening. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she fought them back. Not here, not now, she thought. She couldn't let herself fall apart. She couldn't show weakness, not in front of these strangers who were judging her, who had already made up their minds about her before she even had a chance to speak. "Mom, we need to go," the guard said again, more insistent now. He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out. Sarah stood her ground, shaking her head. "I don't understand. I've done nothing wrong. Please." The guard's grip tightened on her arm, pulling her forward. She resisted, but the pressure of his hand was firm, unyielding. The humiliation began to settle in, creeping through her body like cold water. She tried to pull her arm back, but his grip tightened, and in that moment, all she could feel was the sting of being treated like an outsider, an intruder, simply because of her race. I've done nothing wrong. Why am I being treated this way? Her thoughts blurred together. She had been so careful, so controlled, always working hard, always trying to prove herself. And yet, in this moment, all of that was meaningless. It didn't matter that she had worked harder than most to get here. It didn't matter that she had earned every single thing she had. None of that mattered. The security guards led her out of the store, their hands on her arms as she walked through the mall. The murmurs of the crowd followed her, and it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. She could feel the eyes of people, some of them judgmental, others silently complicit, watching her as she was escorted out, humiliated in front of a crowd. As they reached the mall's exit, Sarah's mind went blank. She had hoped for so long that the world would one day be different, that she would be treated with respect, that she would be seen for who she truly was. But all she had gotten in return was this. Once outside, they released her, and Sarah stumbled back, feeling the weight of the situation crashing over her. The tears that she had been holding back finally fell. She couldn't control them anymore. The injustice, the unfairness of it all was too much to bear. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to calm herself. But the world around her seemed to spin. This wasn't just about the shoes. It wasn't just about the store. This was a reminder that, no matter how far she'd come, there would always be people like him, people who would judge her, diminish her, simply because of her skin color. Sarah wiped her eyes and straightened up. She wasn't going to let this define her. She wasn't going to let them think they had won. She took out her phone, her hand still trembling, and typed out a quick message. Just kicked out of a mall for no reason other than the color of my skin. This can't go unnoticed. She hit send, and a strange sense of defiance filled her chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She would make sure they knew her name. The moment Sarah stepped out of the mall, the world seemed to hold its breath. She was still shaken, trying to steady herself, but the whispers around her were louder than any of the internal dialogue in her mind. She had barely gotten a few steps before she noticed a few heads turning, some of them with concerned expressions, others with visible discomfort. The aftermath was not only about what happened to her, but about how others reacted. As Sarah walked through the glass doors, she could hear murmurs rippling through the crowd. The mall had fallen into a strange silence, a sort of collective pause, as people watched her, some judgmental, some sympathetic, but mostly quiet. A couple of people in the crowd were beginning to speak out. One woman, a young mother holding her child, stepped forward hesitantly. "That's not right," she said loudly, shaking her head as she caught Sarah's eye. "They shouldn't have done that to you." The woman's voice was soft but firm, and for a split second, Sarah felt her heart skip. It was the first voice of support she had heard. The first sign that anyone was willing to stand up against what had just happened to her. Sarah couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. But before she could even acknowledge the woman's words, the crowd remained divided. Many others around her simply turned away, pretending not to notice the incident. They carried on with their shopping, acting as if nothing had occurred. Some exchanged quick, uncomfortable glances, while others went about their business with a clear, deliberate effort to ignore the unfolding situation. There was a man nearby who looked between Sarah and the security guards, then quickly diverted his gaze, as though it was too much for him to process. Another shopper, a young woman with blonde hair and a coffee cup in hand, muttered something to her friend under her breath. Barely audible, "She's just trying to make a scene." The division was palpable. In this moment, Sarah wasn't just facing an injustice, she was up against a larger issue. This was the silent complicity of so many in the face of racial discrimination. The crowd was torn. Some felt the discomfort, others ignored it completely. Some were too afraid to step in. The reaction or lack of it was almost as painful as the event itself. The sense of abandonment was crushing. Sarah's heart sank further as she felt like the people around her had already made their decision. She had already been branded as trouble, and to them, it seemed like it didn't matter whether the accusation was true or not. The voices of support were few and far between, while the voices of indifference seemed to dominate the air. It was a sobering reminder that change, in this moment, wasn't going to come from the people who could make a difference. It was going to come from those who were brave enough to stand up, even if they stood alone. As Sarah made her way out of the mall, her thoughts were swirling with 1,000 emotions: anger, disappointment, confusion, but above all, a deep sense of helplessness. Why was this happening? Why was this still happening? Why did no one seem to care? As Sarah got into her car, the weight of the situation finally started to settle in. She could barely bring herself to start the engine. The car, usually a place of comfort, now felt like a tiny island in the middle of a storm. She sat there in the parking lot, the steady hum of the cars around her barely registering. The world felt like it was pressing in on her, and she was suffocating in the silence of it all. She didn't want to cry, not now, not in the car. She was supposed to be strong. But the moment she looked in the rearview mirror, she saw herself as others had seen her, not as a person, but as someone who could be easily dismissed, someone who didn't belong in spaces that were supposed to be open for everyone. As she started the engine, the tears began to fall. She wiped them away quickly, but the emotional dam had broken, and it felt like there was no stopping it. She had never felt so small, so powerless in her life. Driving away from the mall, she couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, as the city passed by in a blur of lights and colors. But all she could think about was what had just happened and why. She couldn't stop asking herself, why did this happen to me? She had tried so hard to avoid moments like this. Her entire life she had been taught to avoid conflict, to keep her head down, to stay out of the spotlight. Her parents had always told her to take the high road, to work hard, to rise above the discrimination she would undoubtedly face as a black woman in a world that wasn't always kind to people who looked like her. But this wasn't something she could rise above. This wasn't something she could ignore. Sarah thought back to the countless times she had tried to avoid confrontation, to keep a low profile. She had learned early on how to make herself invisible, how to blend in, how to be quiet and unobtrusive. She had always assumed that if she did everything the right way, worked hard, stayed polite, didn't cause trouble, she would be left alone. But nothing she did mattered. She was still a target. It didn't matter how hard she worked, how much she achieved, or how many times she held her tongue. The color of her skin, the thing she had no control over, would always be a reason for someone to hate her, to dismiss her, to judge her. It wasn't just the man who had accused her or the security guards who had escorted her out. It was the people who stood by and did nothing, who silently approved by remaining silent. It was the system that allowed this kind of injustice to continue without consequence. Her hands tightened on the wheel as the questions began to spin faster. Why was I treated this way? What did I do wrong? She could feel the sting of the words the man had said, and the hurt of being ignored by the people around her. It wasn't just about the shoes. It wasn't even just about the mall. It was about something much bigger. It was about a world that constantly judged her, a world that never saw her as equal. Her phone buzzed in her lap, breaking her reverie. Sarah glanced at the screen, wiping her eyes quickly, and saw a notification. Your post has been shared. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked her phone, checking the message. It was a post from a friend, a fellow student from college, tagging her in a comment. This isn't right. We need to stand up for Sarah. Her heart skipped a beat as the comment lit up with responses. The words from that one post, the words she had typed so quickly in the midst of her confusion, had already sparked a small fire. People were beginning to see what had happened. They were speaking out. For the first time in what felt like hours, Sarah allowed herself to feel something different, a flicker of hope. The post wasn't just a rant. It wasn't just an emotional outburst. It was becoming a movement, a conversation that was far bigger than the mall, bigger than this incident. And it was just beginning. As Sarah wiped away the last of her tears, she took a deep breath. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She could feel the fire rising inside her. No longer would she be silenced. No longer would she accept this world where people like her were always made to feel less than. She was going to make sure this wasn't forgotten. But as she drove through the city streets, one thought kept flashing through her mind. This is just the beginning. There were still more questions to answer. There were still more people to face. And most importantly, there were truths that needed to be revealed. The morning after Sarah's humiliating experience at the mall, she woke up to a sense of quiet devastation. She hadn't slept much the night before. Her mind had raced with questions and frustrations, and the thought of what had happened to her played on a loop, as if her brain couldn't stop replaying it. She had never imagined that something as simple as a shopping trip would turn into a public spectacle, let alone a violation of her dignity. As the morning sunlight filtered through her curtains, she grabbed her phone. Her fingers trembled as she opened the social media apps, something she had been avoiding the entire night. But today was different. Today she needed to see if anyone cared. The first thing that caught her eye was the notification. Your post has been shared 1,000 times. Sarah blinked, not quite sure what she was reading. Then, another notification popped up. Your post has been shared by 5,000 people. She felt a knot form in her stomach as she scrolled through the comments and messages that had flooded her social media. People were outraged. The hashtag Justice for Sarah was beginning to trend on Twitter. Stories were being shared on Instagram. Facebook groups were filled with people demanding action and accountability for what had happened. But as Sarah read through the posts, one particular comment caught her attention. A journalist known for his investigative reporting on racial justice had shared her post. We need to know more about the woman this happened to. There's more to this story than meets the eye, he had written. Sarah hadn't realized it, but her story had gone viral. And now, it was being picked up by people who would amplify her voice. She didn't know what to feel. Part of her wanted to hide from the world, to turn away from the scrutiny. But another part of her felt a strange surge of power. People were listening. They cared. Her words mattered. Within hours, the post snowballed into something bigger. The journalist reached out, asking for an interview. He wanted to dig deeper into Sarah's background. Sarah was reluctant at first. What would he even want to know? She was just a woman who had been humiliated in public. But as she thought about it more, she realized this was bigger than her. This wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been silenced by racial injustice. The journalist promised to keep the focus on the truth and the larger issue at hand. As she reluctantly agreed to the interview, she couldn't shake the feeling that this story would not only define her, but it might also change the narrative around race and discrimination. As the interview with the journalist took place, Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with updates. She sat across from the reporter in a small cafe, her mind still in a whirlwind from everything that had happened. He asked her questions about the incident, her feelings, and what had happened afterward. Sarah answered each question honestly, trying to express the depth of her emotions, but she wasn't prepared for what came next. After a few minutes, the journalist paused, tapping his pen thoughtfully on the table. Sarah, I've been doing some research into your background. There's something I think people need to know. You're not just any ordinary woman, are you? At first, Sarah was taken aback. What do you mean? She asked, her voice thick with confusion. The journalist leaned forward, his eyes widening with realization. It's just that I think you're someone a lot of people already know. Sarah's stomach twisted. She had no idea where this conversation was heading. The journalist continued, You've been an advocate for racial justice for years, haven't you? You've spoken at rallies. Your face has been seen in protests. I found videos of you speaking on issues like systemic racism, inequality, and police violence. You've even worked with organizations like Equality Now and the Color of Change. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The reporter was right. For years, she had been a vocal advocate for racial justice. She had spent countless hours volunteering, attending protests, and educating people about the realities of racism. She'd written op-eds, been interviewed on podcasts, and shared her story in the hopes of making a difference. But she had never expected any of it to come back to her like this, especially not in the form of something so painful and public. To her, it had always been about the cause, not the recognition. She had never been in it for the fame or the spotlight. She just wanted to help, to fight for what was right. But now it seemed that the moment of her deepest humiliation was the moment that would reveal just how far her reach had extended. The journalist continued, "Your work in these areas, Sarah, is well documented. People know you, and they look to you as a leader. But what's even more striking is that, despite your visibility, despite your efforts, you were still victimized. You were still treated like an outsider, like you didn't belong in the space you were in. And that says so much about how deep these issues run." Sarah sat back in her chair, trying to digest everything he had just said. It felt surreal. She had spent years fighting for racial justice, yet here she was, on the receiving end of the very thing she had been fighting against. Despite her advocacy, despite her voice, she was still not exempt from racism. The journalist took a deep breath, sensing the weight of the moment. "What's so powerful about your story, Sarah, is that it shows the raw reality of racism. You're not just some random person who experienced this. It's happening to someone who's done the work, who's dedicated their life to this cause. And that shows us that racism doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter how well known you are. It doesn't matter how much good you've done. It will still find a way to attack you." For the first time since the incident, Sarah felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just an isolated victim. She wasn't the only one. Racism affected every part of life, even for those who had dedicated themselves to fighting it. The realization hit her hard, but it also gave her strength. Her story was no longer just about the injustice she had faced at the mall. It was a part of something much bigger. As Sarah spoke to the journalist, she began to understand the full scope of her story. The social media posts were still blowing up, with people supporting her from all over the world. But now it wasn't just about her personal fight. It was about the wider fight for racial equality, and how even the most vocal advocates couldn't escape the systemic racism that still ran deep in society. "People need to understand," Sarah said softly but firmly, her voice steady now. "It doesn't matter how much we do, how much we fight. Racism doesn't go away. It doesn't care who you are or what you've accomplished. It's always lurking, waiting for a chance to strike." The journalist nodded in agreement. "And that's exactly why your story is so important, Sarah. You've lived it. You've been in the trenches. And now you're showing us the truth. It's time for the world to wake up." As the interview concluded, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The incident at the mall had been a painful, unjust experience, but it had ignited something in her. It had shown her that no matter how much progress had been made, there was still so much work to do. Sarah's true identity wasn't just about the recognition or the public persona she had built over the years. It was about her continued fight for justice, her unshakable belief that change was possible, and her unwillingness to let the world turn a blind eye to the truth. And with that, Sarah knew that her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Sarah, sitting in a quiet room, her face calm but her eyes intense. She had gone through so much over the past few days: humiliation, fear, confusion, and eventually empowerment. Now, as she prepared to speak directly to the audience, she took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before addressing the camera. "This wasn't just about me," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. "It's about every black person who's been treated unjustly, who's been made to feel less than. My story is just one example, but it's one that needs to be heard. This isn't something that's rare or unusual. It's something that happens every single day, whether we're talking about shopping in a mall, walking down the street, or just existing in spaces where we should feel safe. It's a reminder that no matter how far we come, how much we do, the color of our skin is always used as a reason to diminish us." She paused for a moment, her hands resting in her lap, as she thought about how far she had come. The weight of the world, the trauma of what had happened, still lingered. But there was strength now, too, a newfound sense of clarity that she hadn't felt before. "I used to think that if I just kept my head down, worked hard, and stayed out of the way, I could avoid these situations. But the truth is, no matter how much we try to make ourselves invisible, racism doesn't let us hide. No matter what we do, we are judged for the color of our skin. And that's why we have to keep fighting." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "But I'm not here to just tell you what happened to me. I'm here to remind you that this isn't just a story for the books. This is happening right now, right in front of you. And it's happening to people just like me, people you know, people you care about. Her voice softened, but the strength behind her words remained. This isn't about revenge. It's about change. It's about the fact that no matter how much pain we endure, we have the power to rise, to speak, and to demand a world where we are all treated equally. And that's why I'm sharing this with you, not because I want sympathy, but because I want action. She took a deep breath, her eyes now filled with quiet determination. We need to challenge the systems that allow this to happen. We need to hold people accountable for their actions, whether they're in the store, in the workplace, or in the streets. We need to make sure that every person, no matter their race, gets to walk through this world with the same dignity and respect. That's the world I'm fighting for. Sarah's expression hardened with purpose as she addressed the camera one last time. If you've been moved by my story, if you've seen how unjust this is, then it's time to step up. We can't wait for change to come. We need to make it happen ourselves. Share this video, leave a comment, tell your own story. Let's keep this conversation going, and let's show the world that we won't stay silent. We won't let this continue. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in. This is bigger than me. It's bigger than one incident. This is about all of us Black people, people of color, and every single person who believes in equality. We need to unite. We need to stand together and push for systemic change, not just in our laws, but in our hearts. She held the camera's gaze, her eyes fierce with conviction. If you believe in a world where everyone is treated equally, where no one is judged based on their skin color, where everyone gets a chance to thrive, then speak up. Stand up. This fight doesn't stop with me, and it doesn't stop with you. Together, we can make a difference. Sarah smiled softly, her voice filled with an energy that had been absent in her earlier reflections. No matter where you come from, what you look like, or where you've been, your identity is powerful. You are worthy of respect, worthy of love, and worthy of the space you occupy in this world. She leaned forward, her face earnest and warm. Stand tall, stand proud, and never let anyone take your worth. You are not the way people treat you. You are not the stereotypes they throw at you. You are a person powerful, capable, and deserving of everything the world has to offer. She paused, her smile widening. And remember, you don't have to fight this fight alone. There are millions of people standing with you, and together, we are unstoppable. With that, she leaned back, the camera slowly pulling away as the screen faded to black, leaving behind a powerful message of strength, unity, and change. Subscribe for more empowering content, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a chance to be part of the change. Share your thoughts, share your stories, and let's continue to push for a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect.